This week on Act Out, caged for seeking freedom, migrants and refugees in the land of the free. Next, zooming out on the global refugee industry because, yeah, that too is a booming business. Finally, coal scare tactics leading Australia's climate policy and how grassroots climate activists are fighting a massive mining project in the midst of a firestorm. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. By now, many have heard stories of the horrors inside the U.S.'s migrant concentration camps. Lack of potable water, no access to showers, little to no food, sleeping, or trying to, like sardines on a cold cement floor with an aluminum blanket. Young children caring for even younger children. Mentally and physically disabled thrown into solitary. Those with illnesses left to suffer and or die in crowded cells with no medical attention. Last year, there were 14 documented hunger strikes at ICE prisons across the nation in order to protest the conditions of imprisonment, but also the very fact of imprisonment, for the oh-so-ironic crime of seeking freedom. Migrants who cross into the U.S. via legal ports with legitimate asylum claims are thrown into jails and denied freedom or access to legal aid in constructing or arguing their asylum cases. As of September of last year, there were some 52,000 immigrants confined in jails, prison tents, and other forms of detention, making the U.S. the country with the largest immigrant detention system. A nice medal to put next to the world's largest prison population. Oh, the land of the free. Last week, reports came in of 2 men from India who are still on hunger strike after 68 days and can no longer walk and are in wheelchairs. They could suffer organ damage or even death within a week, as many hunger strikers do not make it past 75 days. In the meantime, they have been subjected to forced hydration, a practice that both medical professionals and human rights advocates classify as torture. 3 other men at the same facility in Louisiana are on hunger strike but have started drinking fluids. Last year, 16 men on prolonged hunger strike were force-fed at an El Paso facility, according to the local chapter of Advocate Visitors with Immigrants in Detention, AVID. The latest round of strikes began in October, with 5 men refusing to eat by mid-November, including 2 men transferred from a privately run jail in Louisiana for forced medical treatment. It's important that we understand the breakdown of the situation here. People who are entering the country through legal ports of entry with legitimate asylum claims are being put into for-profit concentration camps and tortured without access to legal representation. Everything I just mentioned is a crime against humanity. All of it. And of course, the legality of being a refugee is just an absurd concept in of itself, that the burden of law should be placed on the shoulders of those fleeing atrocities rather than those creating them. The circumstances that create refugees are by definition inhumane, and as it happens, mostly illegal. Acts of war without congressional oversight, unilateral attacks in hybrid warfare, be it through economic sanctions or cyber attacks. Our government breaks international law, creates refugees, and then throws those refugees into concentration camps despite the fact that those refugees follow our own damn fucking laws. For instance, the 2 men on hunger strike at LaSalle in Louisiana have legitimate asylum claims, with documentation to back them up. One was violently attacked after converting to Christianity. The other was attacked and beaten by members of a rival political party. He told Graffio, a volunteer with Freedom for Immigrants, that he would be a, quote, dead man if he was deported to India. So, he might as well take his chances at LaSalle, even if the hunger strike kills him. And again, even if he didn't have a legitimate asylum claim, the torture he is enduring is catastrophically unjust. This one man's suffering is one too many. Now multiply that by 52,000. Well, 52,000 inside the US. Because really, the refugee business, and yes, it is a business, is a global cash crop that depends on the oppression of millions to turn a profit. In a recent current affairs article on refugee camps, author Laura Robeson points out that refugee regimes broadly, and camps in particular, channel money to authoritarian regimes, force refugee populations to serve as sources of cheap labor and experimental data collection, and, above all, reduce political pressure on wealthy countries to liberalize their asylum practices. In other words, they are built specifically to dilute support for the one thing that would help refugees most: the unrestricted right to move where they want to go. She calls out international agreements that create and run these refugee regimes as weapons of, quote, imperialism, authoritarianism, and the most brutal forms of global capitalism. For instance, an infamous example, the UNRWA camps for Palestinians in the Middle East. Funded mostly by the US, these camps were hardly a humanitarian endeavor. American support for UNRWA was conceived as a kind of protection, not just for Israel, which obviously wanted to keep Palestinians enclosed and monitored, but also for American oil interests, which relied on political stability and could be threatened by the unchecked movement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians around the Middle East. So zooming out, we see that most refugee camps are in fact in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Fewer and fewer are in North American and Western Europe countries. Camps are a way to quarantine and make a buck off of those who have no choice but to flee their homes. And while many do manage to avoid camps by refusing to register as refugees, many, of course, fall into the trap. Some 40% of the world's refugees are in camps, a solution that even the UN agrees is a terrible way to deal with refugees, stating that UNHCR's policy is to pursue alternatives to camps whenever possible. And of course, it is possible, but it requires a restructuring of more than just immigration policy. As Robeson writes, the so-called refugee problem isn't a standalone question of effective humanitarian assistance. It's an aspect and a reflection of the much broader issue of global inequality, and camps have become a go-to solution, partly because they render invisible the deep links between refugee crises and the other profound inequities and injustices of our age. We have to work to make these hidden links visible, to uncover not just the horrors within our borders, but how those connect to a global business, a global system and paradigm based on the oppression of refugees, those with nothing to lose and nowhere to go. And of course, we start this work at home. We start this work with one story, one life. Freedom for Immigrants is a good organization to start with. Check out freedomforimmigrants.org to learn more. Australia, though foremost in the news, is not the only country suffering from extreme drought. According to the UN World Food Programme, 5 years of recurring droughts have destroyed maize and bean harvests, leaving poor subsistence farmers in the so-called dry corridor that runs through Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua struggling to feed their families. And as NBC News noted, Central America's choice, pray for rain or migrate. Well, NBC, considering that we just covered in the last segment, that's a true Sophie's choice. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Meanwhile, Chile is in the midst of what scientists are calling a mega drought, one that's lasted since 2010. Half the country has been designated emergency status. If you recall the Amazon fires from last year that now seem small, those were bolstered in no small part by Brazil's most severe drought in more than 60 years. In Africa, some 45 million people across 14 countries have been affected by years of droughts. The Victoria Falls, a once thundering waterfall, is nearly dry. Droughts have also been severe in Laos, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. The Mekong River, which flows through 5 countries, is at its lowest level in 100 years. And of course, the crown jewel of climate chaos for the moment, Australia, where already 3 years ago scientists reported that the continent was experiencing the worst droughts in 800 years. Recently, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology reported that the data is in, and 2019 has topped the charts for average and maximum temperatures, as well as the lowest annual rainfall across the country. Australia is the ghost of Christmas present and future, proof that we are already engulfed in the flames of human folly, and there is more to come. You'd really have to be a sociopathic idiot to not think that this has everything to do with climate change. Enter Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who, when not vacationing in Hawaii while his country burns, is infamously dumb-shitted when it comes to climate issues. Taking a page from our dear Senator Inhofe's book, who, if you may recall, brought a snowball into Congress as proof that climate change isn't real. Taking a page from that picture book of ass-brained idiocy, then Treasurer Morrison dabbled with prop comedy back in 2017 when he all too seriously brought a lump of coal into Australia's House of Representatives, exclaiming, "This is coal." After which he proceeded to tell the baffled audience that this is what keeps the lights on, and if we don't protect it, invest in more of it, we'll be in the dark. Ah yes, the idea that we would all have to live like the Amish during a lean year were it not for coal is a tried and true scare tactic heard round the world. And it's fine to laugh at the absurdity of this line, but when the world you live in is literally on fire, the joke loses some steam. And Morrison is not alone in this devil's funhouse. As Dr. Benoit Kampmark notes in a recent article, Australian governments across colors and persuasions have found managing the environment a problematic and inconvenient affair. Being a country rich in resources ready-made for digging and export, environment ministers have become the executing tribunes of mining rights and interests before the preservation of flora and fauna species. Talk of climate change responses is heavily weighted in favor of pro-emission and polluting measures. Greening projects look like acts of ecological pantomime. Indeed, even as the continent leads the world in cases of mammal extinction, even before these fires, and even now as an estimated 1 billion animals have perished in the flames, dozens if not more species expected to be fully extinct, even now, the Prime Minister and friends are pushing to double Australia's coal-based carbon emissions via a proposed new massive mine. In short, we're being driven off a cliff of climate chaos at astonishing speeds by those who say there's no such thing as cliffs. People like this have to be made examples of, need to be taken down, and we need to share tactics, build networks, and foment solidarity across borders, oceans, and firewalls. A good place to start is that aforementioned proposed mine. For quite some time now, folks with FLAC, Frontline Action Against Coal, have been fighting the Adani Mine project, and their work continues now as fires rage. For instance, last week on January 7th, activists stopped coal trains from being able to export coal from Australia for 6 hours. Here to talk more about the massive new proposed mine and the grassroots resistance to it is Andy Payne, organizer with FLAC. Take a look.
The plan at the moment is to do about 15 megatons per year. They are hoping to expand that as it went on, and the actual total amount would be about 2.3 billion tons is what they're hoping to, which is gigatons, 2.3 gigatons. And so it's a lot of coal. It's 4.7 billion tons of carbon emissions. The mine's been a long, slow process for Adani. The approval process has been going now for almost 10 years. And they have started work clearing some of the land. It will affect about 28,000 hectares of land in the clearing, displacement, and things like that. At the moment, they've cleared a couple of hundred hectares of beginning to build their rail line and some of the infrastructure for the mine. So there's no holes been dug or anything like that, but work is slowly beginning. And after a lot of struggles in court and struggles with government to get the proper approvals, Adani now has all those government approvals in place. And so the mine is getting closer, but at the same time, a lot of the finance isn't in place. There hasn't been much work done on the ground, and there's certainly a lot of public opposition to it in Australia.
Here in the United States, we call it captured agencies. The idea that agencies that are supposed to be looking out for people and the environment are really just captured by the industries that are, the coal mines or other fossil fuels and things like that. Would you say it's roughly the same thing there in Australia?
Oh, absolutely, possibly more. In Australia, the mining industry has an immense power politically. About 10 years ago now, we had a Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who tried to bring in a mining profit super tax. So once mining companies' profits got to a certain amount, their tax would be extremely high. And the mining lobby actually overthrew our Prime Minister. The Labor Party, his political party, dumped him after an intense period of pressure from the mining lobby. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Malcolm Turnbull as well within the Liberal Party, the opposite side of politics, when wanting to take stronger climate action, was pressured again from the mining lobby and people within his own party, and same thing, dumped as Prime Minister. So that's the kind of pressure we're talking about. And in our federal election this year, there was an unexpected swing towards the Liberal Party, the sort of conservative party here in Australia. And a lot of that was assumed to be to do with mining and Adani. And so following that, our state Labor government worried that they would lose their own power over mining, rushed through all these approvals that had been sitting around for a long time. The Queensland government said, okay, we're fed up with this bureaucracy. We're going to set deadlines for all these approvals. And so these supposedly independent environmental planning agencies are all of a sudden at the behest of the government rushing through approvals for this mine, which will have immense environmental effects. And I think that shows exactly what you're talking about, that a lot of these things are captured by what's politically efficient for parties or for the mining industry.
And with regards, you mentioned the environmental effects. I wanted to talk a little bit about that because oftentimes people focus just on the effects of burning coal, which is of course atrocious, but the extraction and construction process is hugely destructive. Can you talk about some of the environmental effects of this mine?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first off is before you even get to the coal, you have to clear an immense amount of land to be able to dig a coal mine. And so that land is mostly it's sort of cattle farms, but it is native habitat for a lot of species and endangered species here in central Queensland. Species that are only in this locality, like the ornamental snake and the black-throated finch. And so there's a lot of concern about that habitat loss. Then, of course, there's the water effects, and Adani will use huge amounts of water, 12 billion litres of water a year for the extraction and washing of coal. And so that's groundwater. A lot of, that doesn't get replenished, that water supply. And so a lot of concerns around that. And then there's, I guess, the dust that comes from a mine in the air, and the barrier reef, which of course suffers the effects of climate change severely as the oceans warm up. Coral can't adjust to that. And also the shipping channel that will be built for the port expansion means dredging that port, which is in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And so there's effects around that as well.
What are some of the tactics that you used in order to stand in their way, either physically or in other ways?
Yeah, it's been a long campaign already, over 5 years of people really strongly resisting the Adani mine, and not just here in Queensland where it's going to be built, but all over Australia. And so a lot of pressure on third parties, financial institutions and contractors who could do that work. And so there's been a lot of lobbying in that way, and also direct action, blockading some of these companies, contracting companies, and saying, if you work on Adani, we're going to continue to resist. And so that's been going already a number of years. And as well as up here where there's the rail line going to Adani's port, and where the mine is being built, there's been some direct action to stop it. And that's what at Frontline Action on Coal, where part of a broader movement against Adani, but where I guess the end that does a lot of that stuff. And so we've done things like suspending people in tripods over the rail line or over roads to block access. We've had tree sits attached to machinery or to the rail line, people locking themselves to machinery. locking themselves to gates to stop entry. And so, concrete barrels. The other day, we had 2 people at the rail and road access to Abbott Point, Adani's port, and 2 people locked themselves to a concrete barrel. So these kind of tactics are things that in Australia have been used traditionally in environmental campaigns, often with a lot of success, and are still being used. They're a non-violent way of putting your body in the way and physically intervening at a point where the government's not doing their job, these environmental departments aren't doing their job. And so we need some way for the everyday person to take it upon themselves, and your physical presence is one way to do that. We have had recently the Queensland government here in response to a lot of the lock-on devices and actions like this. They've proposed new laws that they have put before Parliament that are specifically targeted at what they call lock-on devices. And so the lock-on pipes that you sort of stick both arms in to put around machinery or a concrete barrel or a tripod, to make these devices illegal, and it would be a charge just to possess one or a charge to use one, both those charges carrying a maximum penalty of prison time. And so this is a law currently before the Parliament that we're sort of resisting, saying that the right to protest is important, and these devices, which there's been a lot of government hysteria calling them dangerous devices, nothing compared to the danger of the environmental destruction, the climate destruction that comes from these mines. And this is just a way of demonizing protest. But we'll keep going. Those laws won't stop us. They've never stopped people in the past from standing up for what's right, and they won't stop us now.
So I also wanted to talk not just about the government's response or the court's response, but something that we see here in the U.S. a lot, and I read about it with regards to this mine, the issue of jobs. And Adani experts even admitted that the mine will only result in about 1/10 the number of jobs that they promised, if that. So has there been a response from folks that think that they're going to get jobs, that are trying to argue with you about this?
It's been a massive issue in our political dialogue, this kind of talk about creating jobs and jobs and growth. Scott Morrison, will use jobs. Our Prime Minister will use any kind of jobs as an excuse for anything. And we even see media releases about the construction of new prisons seen as a positive because it's providing jobs. And this is a way of political spin. I guess jobs is code for profits, right? It's corporate profits that they're growing, and they sell it as if it's benefiting the everyday person by saying it's jobs. And it gets a lot of traction. A lot of people need a job. People are in fear of not having a job and everything that comes with that. And in the mining industry, we're seeing the processes of automation are taking away jobs. The industry isn't always very stable. And so here nearby to where we are in central Queensland, the Queensland nickel refinery shut down, cost hundreds of workers their jobs, and there were wages that were never paid there. And so it is something that people are concerned about, and something that whenever the Adani mine is talked about, the environmental effects are always weighed up against the jobs it will produce, and that's something we have to fight against. But you're right in saying that Adani originally, when they proposed it, they just said 10,000 jobs would be provided by this mine. They never provided any facts and figures. And when pressed in a court case against the mine, they had to admit that actually it would be more like 1,500 jobs. And so already that's a massive drop. And when weighed up against the jobs in Queensland, the Great Barrier Reef and tourism around is a massive employer, something like 70,000 jobs in that industry. And so we have, if we really want to talk about jobs, we have a vested interest in stopping climate change, because that's affecting the reef and that tourism industry. And of course, the Queensland's nickname here is the Sunshine State, and the potential for renewable energy is immense if government were to support that, if industry were to support that. And so the jobs argument doesn't really back up, but yet it's pulled out time and time again by people who want to project their own profits as being in the public interest.
So finally, I wanted to talk about something that I saw on the Frontline Action Against Coal site several times. There are native claims, as I understand, to the land that had to be trampled on in order to get final permits for the Carmichael mine. Talk about the intersection there with regards to Indigenous peoples in Australia.
Yeah, so the mine itself will be on the land of the Wangan and Jagalingou people. In Australia, there's over 500 Aboriginal nations across the continent, and so that area belongs to Wangan and Jagalingou people. And it's a conflicted situation because there is a legal process whereby mining companies can approach the traditional owners for what's called an Indigenous land use agreement. And Adani did that and got some members of the Wangan and Jagalingou people to sign that. Others said that was an illegitimate document. It didn't use traditional decision-making processes to come to that conclusion. And so that went to court quite a long time ago now and went through several court cases. The court consistently found against the Wangan and Jagalingou people. And so they've sort of run out of options there. And more recently, announced that they were going to try to set up a camp on their land, which is under the mining lease, to practice their culture. And Adani sort of blocked access. The Queensland government rushed through the signing over the lease to give that land to Adani to enable them to bring in police and have Wangan and Jagalingou people removed from their own land. And so that's been a big story, an ongoing story, and a long fight for Wangan and Jagalingou people. And a lot of Australians from all over the country have really supported them in that and are really concerned about the tokenistic way that Australia can talk about recognising traditional custodians, but then when that conflicts with economic priorities, it has no standing. And so we're very concerned about that. We've always tried to support Wangan and Jagalingou people and work in consultation with them, as well as other Aboriginal nations in this part of Australia. We're working together and we will continue working together on that.
For more on FLAC's work, visit frontlineaction.org and their Facebook page at facebook.com/frontlineactiononcoal. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter. And if you can, donate to keep the show going. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for a few motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed to set my